Good morning. It is great to see you all. A lot of people have asked me about the game tonight, and if you don't know what game I'm talking about, don't worry about it. But for those of you that do know, I would never be so forward as to ask you to pray for the Bengals to win. I wouldn't do that. But I will ask you to pray that they don't lose. And if they don't lose, and you wake up tomorrow and you hear reports that a preacher in town has been arrested for screaming "Who Day" at everybody that passes him in the middle of the night, you'll know it's me. Just go ahead and just know that's true, and we'll be excited about that tonight. Now, I have a question I want to ask you, and it may be a little bit awkward, so don't say anything. I mean, don't like look at anybody or anything like that. But here's the question: has anybody ever made something up about you? Okay, just think about this. Has anybody ever made something up about you? Maybe they said that you said something that you didn't say, or maybe they took something that you did say and they twisted it just enough to give it a new meaning, or they claimed they saw you somewhere that you never were, or they said they saw you do something that you never did. Has that ever happened to anybody? I'm sure it has. Hopefully, the worst thing that can happen is that person made this up, they told somebody else, that person then told somebody else, and before long, they told a lot of people something that was untrue. And hopefully the worst that happened was maybe there were some awkward encounters. You know, you walked in a room and everybody stopped talking and looked at you, and you didn't really know why. Or maybe there was some conflict between neighbors, or a strained friendship, or maybe you missed out on a promotion. You know, you were up for a different job, and there was sort of a whisper campaign behind the scenes, and you didn't even know what was happening, but people were saying stuff about you that just was not true. Or maybe the consequences were more serious than that. Maybe you lost your job. Maybe there was a broken relationship. Maybe you were charged with a crime. Maybe you were even convicted of a crime. A lot of things can happen. If that has ever happened to you, or anything like that has ever happened to you, I want you to know you're in good company. If you have your Bible, I want you to turn to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. Last weekend we kicked off this series in which we're working our way just verse by verse through this letter that Paul wrote. Paul and two other guys, Silas and Timothy, wrote to the church in Thessalonica. It was located on the southern border of Greece, and we're going to put it up on the map just so you can see where it was located. Paul had gone there as part of his second missionary journey and helped to start this young church, this thriving church. That happened sometime in the year 49 A.D. The problem was, almost as soon as he arrived, he had these two powerful enemies that turned against him and conspired to work together to push him out of Thessalonica. They were the secular government leaders who represented the interests of the Roman Empire and the Jewish religious leaders. And together, they were able to force Paul out of Thessalonica sometime in the year 49 A.D. 2 years later, in 51 A.D., Timothy, one of the guys that Paul had left behind to help lead the church in Thessalonica, reconnects with Paul in the city of Corinth. You can see it down at sort of to the south of Thessalonica there. And when they reconnect with Paul, he fills him in on everything that's been happening over the previous 2 years. And he tells him that in spite of all the odds, in the face of all kinds of opposition, not only has this little church survived, but they've thrived. I mean, they've started to make a difference in the community around them. But it's not all been positive. And one of the negative things that's happened is that during those 2 years that Paul has been gone, his enemies, instead of just letting it go because he's gone, have been engaged in this nonstop campaign to discredit him. Now, in our world, we hear a lot of talk about the cancel culture. We hear like, and you know how it works. Somebody puts out a poorly worded statement. Maybe they tell a joke that doesn't land well. They do something dumb in their past, like in high school, or maybe there's a poorly worded tweet or something, and all of a sudden here come all the critics out demanding that person be canceled. Their books have to be taken from the shelves, their shows have to be taken off the air, their products have to be pulled from the stores. We have to erase any evidence at all that this person ever existed. And what's interesting about that, while that used to be, just a few years ago, reserved for more prominent people, like political leaders and athletes and famous actors and musicians. Today, it's been extended to everybody. So a teacher in her classroom, a preacher on a live stream, almost anybody that works a public job. I mean, the mob can come for anybody. Now, it's one thing when it's deserved, and we could talk all day about who deserves what when it comes to the cancel culture, but what about when you're in danger of being canceled for something that you didn't do? What about when you're in danger of being canceled over something that somebody else said you did, or somebody else said that you said? What about this? What about when you're in danger of being canceled, not because of something people think you did or something people think that you may or may not have said, but because of something you believe? That's what Paul was dealing with. In fact, you read through some of the other letters that make up the New Testament, he dealt with that everywhere he went. Throughout his ministry, he had powerful enemies who twisted his words, attacked his character, questioned his motives, and misrepresented his beliefs in a coordinated attempt to eliminate his influence. And that's it. You could say the Apostle Paul was kind of the first victim of the cancel culture. And yet somehow, despite the overwhelming opposition that was coming at him from just almost every angle you can imagine, he continued to make a difference in a world that wanted to silence him. How do you stand firm in the face of a hostile culture? How do you make a difference in a world that wants to silence you? As you transition from chapter 1 into chapter 2 of 1 Thessalonians, Paul briefly addresses some of the criticism that's been directed at him, while at the same time giving us a clear example of how to stand firm in the face of opposition. And just so you know, here's the reason this is important. Just like Paul had enemies who were trying to silence him in the first century, there is a sense in which if you are a follower of Jesus and if you really believe the words of the Bible in the 21st century, there are people, a lot of people, who think you should be silenced. I mean, it's fine if you want to believe certain things, but don't talk about them. Don't post anything about them. Don't share them with anybody, and certainly don't try to influence anybody in your direction. And as long as you do that, you'll do fine. But the minute you say anything publicly, I mean, the minute you try to share what you believe with other people, you're crossing this imaginary line that's been set up by somebody else that just keeps moving. And there will be people that think you should be silenced. So what do you do? 3 things you see in this passage from the Apostle Paul. Here's the first one. If you want to stand firm in the face of opposition, you must have the courage to tell the truth even when it's unpopular. Check out verse 1 of 2 Thessalonians. You know, brothers and sisters, that our visit to you was not without results. We had previously suffered and been treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know. But with the help of our God, we dared to tell you his gospel in the face of strong opposition. Now, to understand what he's talking about, you have to go back. Acts chapter 16. One of the other places that Paul and Silas went on his missionary journey was a place called Philippi. It was located about 100 miles to the north of Thessalonica. We're going to put on the map just so you can see them there together. And when they arrived there, one of the first people they encountered was this teenage girl who could predict the future. We would call her a psychic or a fortune teller. And the reason she could do that is because she had been possessed by this evil spirit. And so after their initial encounter, a few days later, Paul casts this evil spirit out of this young girl. She's restored to health, but instead of celebrating with her, her handlers, the people who have been making money off her, are really upset with Paul and Silas. She'd been doing all the work, they've been cashing all the checks, and now the gravy train has stopped, and they're upset. So they get together this mob, and Acts 16 tells us that they seize Paul and Silas, they drag them into the middle of the street, they strip them of their clothes, they beat them with rods, they flog them, and then they throw them in jail for the night. Now, if you know the rest of the story, Paul winds up leading the jailer and his whole family to Christ. They all get baptized that very same night. But the very next morning, he's dragged before the magistrate, and he's told that he has to leave town. And from Philippi, he goes directly south, 100 miles, to Thessalonica. Now, put yourself in his shoes. What would you have done? You went there to help people and start a church, and instead of helping people, you did help somebody, but instead of being received like a hero, you get beaten to within an inch of your life, thrown in jail, and forced to leave the city. What would you have done? Maybe let's tone it down. Let's not say anything let's let our wounds heal. Let's let the storm blow over. Maybe let's reevaluate our approach. In the future, let's not push so hard. Let's not do anything to alienate the people around us. Let's just make sure that we're building favor with the people. I mean, that's what most of us would have done because that's how we think. But that's not what Paul did. Instead, the very next paragraph in Acts 17 says this. When Paul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. Now check out this part. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days, 3 weekends, he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I'm proclaiming to you is the Messiah. He said, some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a few prominent women. So that's kind of the start of the church that Paul's writing this letter to in 1 Thessalonians. But here's what I want you to catch. Just a few days after getting beat half to death, thrown in jail, and forced out of his city, he goes to Thessalonica, and what's he do? He does the exact same thing that got him in trouble in the first place. Rather than toning it down, he just pushes forward. Rather than holding back, he continues to share the gospel. And unfortunately, though, for him, the response in Thessalonica is not much better than it was in Philippi, because the very next verse in Acts 17 says this, but other Jews were jealous, so they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace, formed a mob, and started a riot in the city. Isn't that crazy? I mean, here's this guy. He gets beat within a half inch of his life, thrown in jail, forced out of the city, goes to a new place, does the exact same thing, and the cycle just starts over. The same thing starts to happen. You say, why would he do that? I mean, why would anybody keep putting themselves in that position? And the answer is he did it because he knew his mission, the thing that God had asked him to do, was to share the truth of the gospel no matter what the response is. That's why in verse 2 of 1 Thessalonians he writes, with the help of our God, we dared to tell you his gospel in the face of strong opposition. One of the hallmarks of Paul's life is that he dared to tell the truth even when it was unpopular. What about you? What about me? Earlier this week, I was listening to a sermon by Bob Russell. He's my favorite preacher. And I was kind of doing something else, kind of listening, kind of half listening, you know, like some of you are right now. You know what I mean? Just so you know, I know, just so you know. And he made a statement in the middle of this sermon that just grabbed my attention, you know, took my attention from whatever else I was doing. And I went back and I replayed it and I wrote it down. Here's what he said. We are coming to an era when the opposition to Christ and Christians is very intense. Years ago, Christians could straddle the fence and please both the world and church people. But the line of demarcation is getting sharper today, and it's tough to do both because there are some people who are so opposed to Christ and to Christian values and are becoming so vocal that you can't possibly please both. Now I wrote that down, and I thought, man, he is so right. I mean, you couldn't be more right. And then it hit me. That sermon was from October of 1991. Think about that. October of 1991. And you think about everything that's happened in the 31 years since then, and it's clear that line of demarcation that he was talking about in October of 91 has only gotten sharper. I mean, we're confronted with stuff now that people in 1991 could not have imagined. Stuff that people in 2001 could not have imagined. Same-sex marriage, not only legalized, but increasingly normalized. Transgender issues, I mean, you watch the Olympics, it's all they talk about. A political system that's gone crazy, an entertainment industry where anything goes, human trafficking all over the world, drug and addiction issues off the charts, and that's just the stuff we know about. I mean, that's just the stuff that we're dealing with today. We have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow. And the question then is, do you have the courage to tell the truth even when it's unpopular? And please don't misunderstand. I'm not saying you have to be obnoxious. I'm not saying you have to be unkind. I'm not saying you have to be angry. Please don't be angry. But you do have to decide if you're going to tell the truth even when it's unpopular. Second thing that you see in the example of Paul, and that's a commitment to please God and not the crowd. Check out what he says in verse 3. For the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you. On the contrary, we speak as those approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. We are not trying to please people, but God who tests our hearts. Now, historians tell us one of the things that complicated Paul's ministry is in the first century, just like today, you had all these false teachers who traveled around from one city to the next. And just like today, they were trying to build a brand. They're building their platform. They're gaining followers so they can sell more products and make more money. Today, we do it through Instagram stories and social media and TED Talks and all that. In those days, they had to actually travel from place to place. And so whenever Paul would arrive in a new place, the people there would be naturally suspicious of him because they just thought, hey, here's another false teacher. He's come here to take our money, and he's going to disappear and go to the next town and take their money. So in order to combat against that, one of the things Paul would do whenever he arrived is he always went out of his way to communicate why he was there. Never tried to trick the people, never tried to flatter the people, never tried to ingratiate himself with the people. He started right from the beginning. He said, here's why I'm here, and here's what I believe, and here's what I think you should believe. And in doing so, he set himself up to experience some pretty significant opposition. But the reason he could do that is because of what he says in verse 4. Look at it again in your Bible where he writes, we are not trying to please people, but God who tests our hearts. Now, here's the thing you have to understand about Paul. His goal was never to build a big following. It was never to build his platform so he could sell more products and make more money. Instead, his whole life was about clearly delivering the message that had been entrusted to him. He knew that his role was not to change the message, not to obscure the message, not to even soften the rough edges of the message. His only responsibility was to share the message. Now compare that to how a lot of us operate. One of the things that I struggle with, and I bet some of you do too, is the need to be liked. I don't know if it's in our DNA or what, but there's something about us that we want the people around us to like us. We want to feel like we're part of the in group. We want to feel like we're accepted. It's probably worse like when you're young, but I don't think it ever goes away. I mean, even as you get older, there's certain tables that you want to sit at and certain clubs that you want to be a part of and certain circles that you want to be included in. And so the temptation is always to just go along with the crowd. We're not going to say anything controversial, don't want to rub anybody the wrong way because the number one thing is that I maintain my position in the crowd. But then what inevitably happens is there are these collisions that take place between what the crowd believes and what the Bible says. And sometimes the collisions are pretty violent. Sometimes they're pretty heavy. And it's when those collisions take place that you have to decide, am I more worried about pleasing people or pleasing God? At some point you have to decide, who's my primary audience? Is it my classmates? Is it my coworkers? My mom and dad? Is it my extended family? Is it the people who are part of my social circle? Or maybe it's the people who are part of the social circle that I wish I was a part of. For some people, it's the faceless mob on social media. Everybody that follows them, they're just trying to stay a part of the group. But at some point, you have to ask yourself, who is it that I'm trying to impress? Is it the crowd of people around me, or is it the God who's above me? And it's not until you can answer that question that you'll know what to do when one of those collisions takes place. See, for Paul, the easiest thing in the world would have been to quietly sneak into Thessalonica, innocently show up at the synagogue, teach a few harmless Bible studies, kind of work behind the scenes, build some relationships with the people, build some favor with the people, and let the heat die down, and then maybe say something. But that's not the way Paul operated, because Paul was living not for the approval of the crowd, but for the approval of God. He knew his job was to deliver the message exactly as it had been entrusted to him. Now, one more thing you see, if you're going to stand firm in a hostile culture, You must have the willingness to sacrifice for the mission. Check out what he says in verse 5. If I can find it. There it is. You know, we never use flattery, nor did we put on a mask to cover up greed. God is our witness. We were not looking for praise from people, not from you or anyone else, even though as apostles of Christ, we could have asserted our authority. Instead, we were like young children among you, just as a nursing mother cares for her children. Paul was so deeply committed to the mission of reaching lost people. He was willing to do whatever it took. Over in 1 Corinthians 9, he explains his approach this way. He said, to the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I've become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. What's he saying? He said, I'm willing to do whatever it takes, go wherever I have to go, connect with whoever I have to connect with, and put myself in a position to experience whatever I have to experience for the sole purpose of trying to share the gospel with lost people. And as you look closer, there are three things in particular that he says he sacrificed during his stay in Thessalonica. First, he says he willingly gave up his right to make money. He gave up his right to demand payment from the people. The reason he did that is not because he didn't have a right, because in other places he says, as an apostle sent by Christ, he had the right to demand financial support, but he willingly gives that up because of these people's past experiences with these false teachers. He doesn't want them to think that he's only about the money because of the other guys that were all about the money. So he says, hey, we didn't put on a mask to cover up our greed. In fact, verse 9 says he worked part-time as a tent maker in order not to be a financial burden to the congregation. The second thing he gave up was his right to popularity. He says, we were not looking for praise from people. Paul never measured success by the sound of applause because he knew that popularity can be fleeting. The same people that cheer for you today can kick you out tomorrow. I mean, you can be on top today and you can be at the bottom tomorrow. That's just how it works. So if you're going to measure success by popularity, it's going to be a lonely existence. And then last thing he mentions, he gave up his right to a powerful position. He said, even though as apostles of Christ, we could have asserted our authority, instead, we were like young children among you. Paul was not a guy to throw his weight around and make demands of the people around him. He never went around demanding that he be treated like some sort of a celebrity or that someone that other people ought to defer to. Instead, he saw himself primarily as a servant. He saw his role as one of humbling himself so that he could build others up. Now here's the question. With all of that in mind, I want you to ask yourself, when's the last time I sacrificed something for the sake of the mission? Anything. When's the last time I sacrificed something for the sake of the mission? For example, when's the last time you passed on an opportunity to make a significant amount of money because it would pull you away from too many worship services? Or how about this? When's the last time you took a public stand on something that you knew would be unpopular and could potentially put a target on your back? How about this? When's the last time you gave up something that you had a right to expect so that you could serve other people that by all rights should have been serving you? When's the last time you gave up anything for the sake of the gospel? I have a picture I want to show you. One of the major things that's happening in the world right now as we sit here that sort of faded from the headlines is the deteriorating situation inside of Afghanistan. I know the news cycle, man, it just spins so fast, it's hard to keep up. And this has pretty much faded over the last few weeks. And we could debate the rest of the day about why this happened and how we got here and all that sort of stuff. But the basic storyline goes like this. After 20 years of occupation, the United States withdrew its remaining soldiers from Afghanistan in August of 2021, a few months ago. Unfortunately, once that happened, within just a few days, the entire country was taken over by a radical Muslim group called the Taliban. Apparently, they had just been waiting for 20 years for their opportunity, and when it came, they seized it. Since then, the situation inside Afghanistan has gone from bad to worse. The power grid has failed. Almost everybody in the country is without power. The hospital system has collapsed. Most schools have closed. And according to the United Nations, listen to this, nearly 60%, think about this, 60% of the people are in danger of starving to death. Not 6%, 60%. It's hard to wrap your mind around. A few weeks ago, CBS News did a heartbreaking story that some of us were sharing around, which they interviewed some fathers who have been forced to sell their daughters into slavery for a single meal and some clean drinking water. Interviewed one guy on there. He sold a kidney so his kids could get some food. I mean, we think that sounds like a nightmare, man, but that's their everyday existence, everyday occurrence for them. And if you happen to be a Christian, the situation is even worse. Historically, Christianity inside of Afghanistan can be traced all the way back to the end of the first century when the Apostle Thomas and some of his closest associates planted the first church there. But unfortunately, over the years, that part of the world has turned into a Muslim stronghold. As of today, it's estimated that 99.9% of the 38 million people who live in Afghanistan are Muslims. And there's only somewhere between 10 and 12,000 Christians left in the entire country. What makes it worse, though, is that number of Christians is rapidly declining. And the reason for that rapid decline is that one of the Taliban's stated goals, and you think I'm making this up, you can go to their website. They have a website. You can actually read this. One of their stated goals is the complete elimination of Christianity from Afghanistan. It's one of their goals. One researcher who works for a group called Open Doors USA explained it this way. He said, it's never been easy to be a Christian in Afghanistan. The moment an Afghan decides to follow Christ, they know there will be consequences. You will lose your job. If you're a university student, you'll be kicked out of school. Some of them have lost custody of their children and they can lose possessions. They've always known they might lose their lives. But listen to this. I said they've always known they might lose their lives, but now it's almost a certainty. Because of that, 2 weeks ago, Afghanistan passed North Korea as the worst place on the planet to be a Christian, the most dangerous place in the world to be a Christian. And just so you understand, it is now a state-sanctioned capital offense to be a follower of Jesus inside of Afghanistan. No trial, no lawyers. If they find you, they kill you. There have been confirmed reports of Taliban soldiers going door to door through these neighborhoods and through villages, and even people that live out in the villages. Everybody's got a cell phone, everybody's got an iPhone. So what they do, they go into these people's homes and they confiscate all of the phones. And they look through your apps, and if you have the Bible app downloaded on your phone, guess what happens? They take custody of your children, they execute you, and then they take your phone and they download all the contacts in hopes of finding other people who might be a part of a church or who are following Jesus. Again, sounds like I'm making that up. Everyday occurrence for them. The picture you see on the screen, you'll notice the lady's face is distorted, and that's because, for her safety, she goes by the name Riza. And she's one of the few remaining leaders in what's called the underground church movement in Afghanistan. It's a group of churches that meet in homes and literally in basements in secret, trying to keep their existence a secret. As you can tell, what they do, she's in a major city in Afghanistan. What her little church does as a part of the movement is they collect food and supplies, and they then take that out to people who are living in the outer regions who are even worse off than they are. And that's part of the way they minister to one another. To make a long story short, almost all of her friends are dead. Almost everybody who made up the little church that she was a part of is dead. The few remaining family members that she has the ones that are still alive, think that she's an infidel and should be publicly beheaded, and would probably do it themselves if they had the opportunity. Now, the other thing you need to know about the church in Afghanistan is that even though it's the most dangerous place on earth to be a Christian, according to the people who track this kind of thing, it's also now the second fastest growing church in the world. Now you hear that and you say, that doesn't seem to compute. I mean, how could it be that the most dangerous place on the earth to be a Christian is the place where the church is growing the fastest? That doesn't seem to make any sense. How can that be explained? And the answer is it can be explained through people like Reza. She was interviewed in a magazine just a couple weeks ago, and she was asked, when all of this started, now, August of 2021, why didn't you leave? Why didn't you seek political asylum? And you could have been a refugee somewhere else where they were a little more tolerant of Christianity. And here's what she said. Here was her answer to that. She said, the ones that have stayed are willing to risk their lives to move the gospel forward. Let me say it again. The ones that have stayed are willing to risk their lives to move the gospel forward. Then she added, Afghanistan is not lost. All that the Lord did before this has not been wasted or lost. No, the Lord is going to do something even more magnificent with fewer people, because the ones that have stayed are willing to risk their lives to move the gospel forward. Let me ask you, what is it that keeps you from sharing the gospel? You afraid you're going to get canceled? You afraid somebody's going to talk about you behind your back? You afraid somebody's going to post something on Facebook about you? You afraid you're not going to get invited to the next lunch outing at your job? God help us. And I know how it is. Last couple of years, man, everybody's a little bit scared. Everybody's a little bit nervous. But here's the deal. At some point, man, you got to decide. Am I living to please the crowd around me? Or am I living to please the God above me? I want you to stand with me. Just a moment. We're going to sing two final songs. And as we do, if you're here and you're not a Christian and you feel the Holy Spirit prompting you to become a follower of Jesus, we would love to walk you through that decision. Others of you may be here. You may be ready to move your membership at FCC and become a part of our family. If that's you, we'd welcome you with open arms. For most of us, though, it's not so much a public decision as it is a private pivot. See, the truth is, and I'm guilty of this too, the truth is that some of us have lost our edge. We've been so concerned about being comfortable and staying safe that we've just sort of forgotten the reason we're here. And that needs to change. I love the way Reza said it. The ones that have stayed are willing to risk their lives to move the gospel forward. And I don't know about you, but I want to be a part of that group. And I hope you do too.